Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode. In the recent G20 summit, China was in focus for many reasons, but just one of them was because of an incident that went viral because of how unprecedented it was in an event like this, where a head of state, that is China, verbally attacked another head of state, that is Canada, publicly in front of cameras. Is China trying to do a posturing and send a message across to the world? In recent years, China has had serious military conflicts with India, which has not been seen in the previous 45 years. China is in territorial disputes with 18 other countries at the moment. What can be expected from China's behavior from here on? What does it mean for India's stability, which shares a 3,000 kilometers border with China? And how effective has been India's responses so far? To talk more on this, we have with us today a very distinguished guest, Indian Ambassador Rajiv Dogra. Ambassador Rajiv Dogra was India's ambassador to Italy and Romania and India's last consul general in Karachi, during which time he had gained a huge prominence. He has written various best selling books, including the most recent one called Wartime, where he talks about the possibility of a long, continuous war between India and China.
16, 17 rounds of military level talks have taken place. The Chinese have not moved back. And please don't forget, the Bangladesh operation was brilliant militarily.
Has China taken away Indian territory for the first time after 1962?
In a conflict situation, it can be dangerous because Chinese submarines or Chinese warships can interdict an Indian, let's say, commercial ship bringing oil to India. Biden Xi meeting does not put America in a strong and great light.
And do you think that Xi had actually premeditated it, pre-planned it to show to the world that he can show an anger to Canada and get away with it and publicly make him lose face?
Chinese themselves have been leaking to the press their version of events. Unhappiness of a Don, of a godfather, that he remains inscrutable, but there is iron fist behind that face. The list of countries which have been ravaged seems to be endless. Libya, Iraq, Yemen, no one talks about the trauma that Yemenis have gone through. Despite the numbers increasing for autocracies, as I said, the judgment would be in favor of democracy. And that is why India stands to gain in the opinion of the world court vis-a-vis China.
Ambassador Rajiv Dogra, a great delight to have you on my show. Thanks so much for making the time, and a very, very great honor to have you.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be talking across continents on something which relates to two different countries in a continent that you left behind.
Well, yes, I left behind, but actually, it's something that's very close to my heart, and it is one of the two most emerging and very prominent continents that affects the rest of the world as well. So, it is a subject that would actually mean a lot for the whole world. So, we will start by talking. The theme of this episode would be mostly about India China relationships. But we would have to go a little later on to what just transpired in the G20 summit with regards to China, because I would really like to hear your thoughts on it. But we will start with India, China, and what has been going on for the past few years and what it means. My first question is, for the past few years, we have seen a kind of conflict between India and China militarily that has not been seen since 1967. And you have written a book called The Wartime, where you have mentioned something like a serious and growing asymmetric relation between India and China. So I would like to know from you what changed. So if India could deter China for the past few decades from militarily colliding with it, why has it started now? And what are China's drivers behind starting it?
Well, I would start with what Deng Xiaoping said. He said, hide your strength, bide your time. So all along, China was preparing to add to its strength. And I think after Deng left and Xi came in, he came in 2012, China was well prepared to face the world on its terms. It was no longer hiding its strength. In fact, it was displaying its strength. The friction between India and China started only after she came in.
So are you
Uh,
saying it's just Xi's own personal agenda that he's driving in all this? Is it just one personal person, a strong man who is driving this, or has it been China's plans all along?
well, I think historically we have undervalued the contribution and determination of leaders to drive an agenda in the term that you have put it. Uh, I am a strong believer that personality determines the course of history. Had Napoleon not been there, would the wars have followed? Had Hitler not been there, would Second World War have taken place? Perhaps it might have because of the circumstances, but not in the form that it took. Perhaps it may not have taken place at all, and negotiations may have proved to be successful, slow but successful. So similarly, she has a particular personality, and he came in at a point in time when China had risen. Deng, that I spoke of earlier, his predecessor a couple of times removed, uh, was in China at a time when China needed a slightly mellow touch and someone who had the managerial capacity to make it consolidate its gains and its ambitions. So Deng performed that role brilliantly, and so did some of the others who followed. But when she arrived on the scene, he had Mao like ambitions, both for the country and for himself. He wanted to be as great a leader as Mao in terms of what he thought Mao had done for the country.
So if I
Uh,
were to just ask you here, during Mao Zedong's time as well, India was attacked many times, and in China did manage to take a lot of territory, but it stopped after 1967 because India did manage to give a very bloody nose to China at that time, and after that, it didn't even come into the picture during 1971 war against India, and for all these years, it had actually stopped. So, do you think there is anything to do with any change in India's policies, India's actions that has led to this?
that's a good question, and I'm glad you interjected. Uh, Mao, in fact, in one of his conversations with an American interlocutor, he said India needed to be taught a lesson. And Mao had achieved whatever he wanted in terms of territorial gains. And that is why they withdrew from some of the territorial gains they had taken in 1962. On Indian sides, 1962 was a big psychological blow, both at the political level and at the military level. So 67 was, in a way, a sort of retrieving some of the lost pride, not entirely, not in full measure, but at least in some parts of it.
But it was
Uh,
India was able to contain China after 67, and it was really a message that went to China also that India is strong enough and it's best not to meddle militarily, because for a long time the military action didn't happen between the two countries.
you're right. It did not happen between the two countries. And there's a reason for it. After 62, India
After
went,
67,
no, after
okay,
62, India went on defense acquisitions and defense preparedness in a big way.
all right.
In fact, from below 2%, almost 1.5% of the GDP, our defense budget increased almost to 4% by the time Rajiv Gandhi took over. And all the acquisitions, like Mirages, new ships, Bofors guns, and so on, were made during that time. So between 62 and 80s, there was a huge marked difference in the defense capabilities of India. And please don't forget, the Bangladesh operation was brilliant militarily, and it showed the world, when you can face up to America, and when you knew that China is right there at the mountain top, it could come calling in when it's a defense card anytime. So it meant that India was ready. India was ready to face any sort of unexpected adventure by a country, that means Pakistan plus. And it came out very successfully and admirably so in 1971. So that was one reason, one major reason why China took note of this fact. And despite American pressure, China did not uh, commit itself to any adventure throughout that fortnight when the Indian Pakistani war lasted until Bangladesh was liberated by Indian forces. Uh, this military strength and the optimism about our capabilities continued right up to the beginning of this millennium. I would say even up to 2005 or perhaps a little later. But then China raced ahead. It stole technology from America and wherever else, and it came up with the best in terms of fighter aircraft, submarines, ships, and so on. And today it has reached a stage where its naval strength is likely to exceed that of America in the next year or so. And its stealth fighters, the aircraft fighters, are as good, at least it claims so, though Americans don't agree, as American fighter aircrafts. So today, it will be difficult to say whether, in terms of armaments, India can match up to China.
Mhm.
In terms of its soldiers, in terms of their determination, India can match up to the best in the world, be it America or China or any other country. But they also need the support of the best in technology, be it drones or weapons of other variety. So China certainly, in overall terms, today is uh, ready to face, let's say, America. What happens in an Indo-China context is difficult to say at the moment.
Right. I'll have to ask you this that after the 2020 Galwan Valley clashes, there were reports that China has actually taken in Indian territories. And this has been disputed by the government of India, which said that the two armies have gone back to the pre standoff period. But various reports by The Guardian and The Telegraph say that China has taken away 40 square kilometers in the Pangong Lake and 20 square kilometers of very strategic land in the Galwan Valley, which was not disputed at all. From your reading of the situation, what do you think? Has China taken away Indian territory for the first time after 1962?
Well, according to reports, this creeping in started before 2020. Depsang, for example, some reports are that as early as 2012, they took about 900 odd square kilometers of territory in Depsang, which is a very critical and strategy-wise a very important area. And the other bets which you have mentioned were over a period of time thereafter, 2014, 2018, then 2000, early 2020. So these encroachments or taking of territory were not simultaneous or not in one big blow, but over a period of time. Why did it happen? I think part of the blame or part of the misfortune, I would say, maybe because we did not acknowledge what is there on the ground.
Why
In
didn't
fact,
we acknowledge it? Isn't it giving it in a platter to China if we don't even acknowledge that we have been taken over?
well, that is your view, but the political view or those in authority may have different considerations. Uh,
What are your considerations? What do you think is best to do in a situation?
well,
Is it good to deny for a country that our land has been taken and help them actually in their narrative that, okay, your government says this, so why are you complaining about it? You cannot take it anywhere in any international forum. And that actually emboldens them to do it more.
well, firstly, I would never disagree with a wise questioner. So I would agree with your premise that if China has taken over or come into a part of our territory, then it makes sense to share it with the public, because in the age of satellite technology, when every square inch of land can be photographed and photographed very clearly, and there are satellite evidences which are there in public domain now. Televisions have telecast it. There have been reports in newspapers and magazines and in social media in general, showing exactly where Chinese troops are at a particular point of time. So I think future historians may, like you, wonder whether it was wise to have not acknowledged a fact that was there on the ground. Secondly, the longer you keep acquiescing in that encroachment, the more difficult it will become at a future date to reverse history and to go back in time when Chinese were no longer there.
Yeah.
So I agree with you that I think we need to think about it a bit more, and perhaps even now uh, there may be time for us to acknowledge, yes, this has happened and something has to be done about it, because 16 17 rounds of military level talks have taken place. The Chinese have not moved back.
That's true. And I would like to ask you here, what has been, I mean, what is your reading of India's responses so far? So, what you're saying is it started in 2013 after Xi came in and the Depsang clashes started, when the slight slicing of Indian territories by China started as well. With that, they have also started the Belt and Road initiatives since 2013, where they are surrounding India from all sides with other countries, where they have creating infrastructure as well as making them indebted to China and basically isolating India from all sides. How worrying do you think it is? And with that, as they have started militarily attacking in little bits Indian army as well, what do you think has been India's response so far in terms of a holistic approach, in terms of strength, in terms of strategy, in terms of how far it has been effective so far? It has been nearly a decade now.
Well, I would like to give a slightly different interpretation to the Chinese infrastructure ambitions. Uh, BRI is not solely directed against India. And BRI, in my view, is a slightly overambitious and perhaps a bit confused project, because you cannot just have roads going hundreds and thousands of miles, or railway
But
network.
with that, there are naval bases as well, isn't it? Isn't China also creating?
I'll come to
Sure.
that also. Or you cannot have a railway network going from China up to Europe, which is transporting, let's say, to give you a factual data, $300 million in 4 months was transported from China to Europe, whereas $300 million worth of business is transacted by four largest seaports of China in a couple of hours. So it does not make sense to spend so much of money laying a railway line when it is of no use or very little use comparatively. Secondly, even in terms of highways that they have poured in so much of money of theirs, uh, you have practical use of highway if along the highway there are industrial townships, there are consumers and producers. That is not happening because that will take another few trillion dollars.
True.
So whether this is a commercial venture or, as you put it, a strategic venture remains to be seen. But even in terms of strategy, you cannot keep on building highways all over the world. Yes, the one which they are building up to Gwadar, the highway,
Mm.
uh, that has strategic dimension. And that is why we have objected to it, that it is going through our territory in POK. And at every opportunity, India has raised that concern. Now, coming to your seaports, Gwadar should be the most worrisome
Mm.
because a port like that can, in a difficult situation or in a warlike situation, stop the free flow of, let's say, trade or oil from Gulf onto India or Japan or wherever else. So that has a major strategic implication. Plus, it also has strategic implication because it can be a basing area, a basing port for China's submarines and warships and so on. So that string of pearls, that term which has been used for the ports which China has built from Djibouti to Gwadar to Hambantota in Sri Lanka, that is purely strategic. To say that Gwadar will suddenly have trade of trillions of dollars is being extremely unrealistic. So
It is masqueraded as a civilian project where it is actually a military strategy that is going on.
absolutely. I mean, they might say that it is Disneyland, but the world is not going to be fooled by that. It is pure and simple, strategic in its aims and objectives.
So
Uh,
how dangerous is it for India, this entire thing that is happening?
well, as I said, in a difficult situation, in a conflict situation, it can be dangerous because Chinese submarines or Chinese warships can interdict an Indian, let's say, commercial ship bringing oil to India.
Hmm.
So naturally, if your oil supply, just like Europe is facing now, because of American sanctions, Europe cannot get oil it wants or gas it wants. And the results are there for everyone to see, the
Hmm.
economic misery that it has brought on itself. So while let's hope that such a situation does not arise for India, because India also has its navy ships and submarines in the Indian Ocean wherever necessary. But the fact is that a unfriendly portion of the sea is something that you cannot be comfortable with.
So, what do you think has been India's responses so far? I mean, in terms of how effective has it been, and where do you see it going from here? Is it India just reacting towards it or towards China's agenda, or is it that there is something proactive going on, which you think is effective enough?
Well, let's be clear that India cannot build a similar Gwadar-like port opposite Chinese, let's say, territory in some part of the South China Sea because it's not practical and that will not be wise. But India has not been sitting idle. Quad is one response where you are taking care of your concerns, security concerns, not in any offensive manner, but in terms of your collective sort of thought process that how do we secure our defense interests or freedom of passage in that vast ocean opposite India, starting in fact from Africa and going almost to Japan and then on to America and Australia. So Quad is one response. The second is the acquisitions of various types that India has taken on a priority basis, be it drones or be it aircraft which can track submarines. Then the aircraft carrier which India has built, the second aircraft carrier. So it is not as if India has been sleeping. India has been making its efforts. It has been preparing itself, but it cannot be an overnight process and it cannot be on war footing because we do not want to get into a war mode and it is not necessary also.
So, where do you see it going from here? Since you see that China has been actually doing a lot of different things to basically create its own dominance, and perhaps dominance more over somebody who is another dominant figure in the area, which is India. If if this continues, do you see in the next few years things can get suddenly very dangerous for India, or do you think that this will just be a mellowed, slow process, and maybe suddenly we will see a surprise?
This is a thought or a question that I debated within myself as to what will happen, let's say, not just in the next few years, but by 2035,
Hmm.
where would this region be? Where would the world be? Uh, and it was complicated because today the world is complex. It is much more complex than it has been for a very, very long time. Uh, and the ultimate and blunt message that I conveyed in Wartime, my book, uh, was that India has to be on guard because, again to quote Deng, when Rajiv Gandhi went to China in 1988, he said the next century is going to be the Asian century, that means the present century. And he stopped there. He did not say who in Asia would the next century belong to. Later on, people who thought over it came to the conclusion, and by Chinese actions and designs, that it is what he and other Chinese leaders feel, that it's going to be the Chinese century. And that is how they have been behaving. For example, in summits with America, they behave as if they are equals, if not already superior. So Chinese ambitions are global, but to get on to the global summit, they have first to climb the Asian summit. And to climb the Asian summit, they have to make sure that they are the only one at the top.
And they are being
So,
successful so far.
well, let's uh, not come to a definite conclusion. They are definitely an Asian superpower, but India is not too far behind. And that is what rankles them. They do not want the Asian summit to be shared by India or for India to be anywhere near the top. So that was, that was a thought process which led me to the conclusion that I have given in wartime. And I think I and I hope that I am not far wrong. And the reviews that have come in have on the book have supported my line of thinking. So I'm very happy with that. I was not being radical, but only rational in coming to that conclusion.
True. See, over the past few years, the trade with China has been increasing at the same time as the border disputes has been increasing. The trade with China is a one-way street where imports from China has been hugely increasing and exports has been slowly decreasing. The imports are also in those kinds of commodities which are very essential for India, for example, raw materials for factories, electronics, etc., and which makes India more and more dependent. So, how do you see these going together? That now China has surpassed for the first time US in terms of imports done by India as a country. So, where do you see this going together, and what are your suggestions that India should do?
You know, the entire thing is puzzling because the intent of the government and the intent of, let's say, the opinion makers is that we must reduce our imports from China. We must do something so that we don't become overly dependent on China. We have been dependent on China in critical sectors like telecommunication and power, to the extent that our telecommunication manufacturing sector was virtually wiped out, and so was nearly the power sector. And that is not a happy situation because it is also bad from a security, national security point of view, because both power and telecommunication are the virtual lifelines of any country. As you've seen in Ukraine just now, Russia is pounding away at their power projects and causing them huge misery, not just in terms of the domestic light, but in terms of national economy and perhaps to some extent their security issues. So I think, for immediate commercial reasons, may have become dependent on China. Uh, but whether that was wise, I have my doubts. Similarly, we became lazy, let's say, in the toy sector, the entire toy industry. Your gods and goddesses, their images were being manufactured in China and brought here. So it does not make a pretty picture to wipe out your own industry so that you can start importing more from China. Whether that may have been the intention or not, it will not be fair to say, but that was the end result of it. So I think even now it is not too late to do something radical in order that our dependence, at least on the critical sectors, comes down to as close to zero as possible. Naturally, trade relations between two neighbors should exist and will continue to exist, but they should be in the non-critical sectors so that India's national security does not get affected.
So, what do you think does India have as levers at this time so that it can give a fight and a fight good enough for China? I mean, if they were to come and attack us at a whim, or they were to stop the trades that we are very dependent on, or they were to create more infrastructure, more provocative things with allies of India's neighbors, where do you think does India have certain levers that it has not maybe used, in your opinion, that it can use and should use to get ahead of China?
India is not a tiny country, and India is not defenseless or helpless. India has a well regarded army, a well trained army, a well tested army, which has proved itself over and over again in the last few decades, be it Kargil after 1971 or a little earlier in 1967, which you mentioned. So, India's strength is its men and the material that will back our men. So it is not as if China can one day get up from its bed and start attacking India. They also know that confrontation carries considerable risk. And as Russia has found to its disappointment in Ukraine, uh, war need not lead definitely to victory. War can lead to major wounds. So China will have to be careful before it steps across Himalayas and starts shooting. So I don't think we should be overly worried that a war is going to break out tomorrow or day after. But we have to be prepared, and that is what India is doing.
Wonderful, very assuring answer. I want to ask you, as India and China are two very strong, emerging and dominant figures in Asia and actually worldwide, one is a democracy, one is an autocracy. What do you think is a long-term way of finding victory? I mean, even if you are powerful in terms of an army, or do you think it's an advantage for India, being a democratic country, to gain a lot more clout over the world?
Well, this democracy versus autocracy is a debate that has been going on from Plato's time. And it has been going on also in India from ancient times. Ram Rajya was about democracy. So there are conflicting views on this, and this debate has taken more urgency today because today the number of autocracies in the world have increased phenomenally. In fact, this millennium has been unfortunate in that sense, that suddenly, because of a variety of reasons, economic or social unrest or whatever, uh, people, whether in Hungary or Turkey or Russia or China or there are many other countries I can name, have taken the path of the least resistance and opted for a one man rule. Whether they opted for it or the one man
Or
took
a
over and
strongman rule.
strongman rule. So autocracies have become the domineering theme, unfortunately, in the world today. And that carries its own risks and dangers because autocrats over a period of time have never proved to be uh, good for the country they have ruled over. Uh, so, in that sense, yes, my vote definitely goes to democracy, and the outside world, in fact, looks up to India as it had looked up to India during the period when it championed non alignment or anti racism and so on, anti colonialism. So, similarly, now uh, the opinion of people at large is definitely to breathe free, to live in an atmosphere where they can express themselves freely. And that is why the popularity of social media. Because if I go on to Twitter, I can say within bounds of decency anything I wish. That is what democracy is about: the ability to express yourself, the ability to be uninhibited. Whereas autocracy, I mean, look at the way she has handled COVID. He has put major cities in lockdown for 2 months and more and not allowed a single resident to come out of his house. Democracies would not allow that, or a Democrat would not inflict that on his people. So, that by itself is a great advantage. And I think in the ultimate judgment or in the ultimate court of the world opinion, uh, despite the numbers increasing for autocracies, as I said, the judgment would be in favor of democracy. And that is why India stands to gain in the opinion of the world court vis-a-vis China.
Very nice, December. Very beautiful answer. I'll come to the next one about what just happened in the G20, among many other things, what transpired between Trudeau and Xi. And do you think that Xi had actually premeditated it, pre-planned it to show to the world that he can show an anger to Canada and get away with it and publicly make him lose face, and especially with the animosity that was building up between Canada and China and a show of power with the detention of the CFO of Huawei and the kind of hostage diplomacy that they were talking about, as well as China's accused meddling in Canadian elections. So, with that brewing up, do you think Xi wanted had a plan to show to his citizens and to the world that he has an upper hand by being able to show in public the anger that he has with Canada and get away with it?
Well, I am convinced that it was a calculated move. It was a well thought out move. I have tweeted about it. And in my tweet, I made 2 points: that she was unhappy. I would not use the word angry because she does not betray anger in his facial expressions. But it is the unhappiness of a don, of a godfather, that he remains inscrutable, but there is iron fist behind that face. Uh, so he was unhappy at the way Canada had imprisoned a Chinese industrial business heiress for 2 years nearly. Uh, so he wanted to convey a message to Trudeau that was not on. Secondly, that thing about being leaked to the press and so on. Chinese themselves have been leaking to the press their version of events and their version of talks between the leadership. So Chinese are no saints there. But he, by giving a dressing down to Trudeau, uh, this was another way of telling to the outside world that look, China is the boss.
Hmm. What do you
So
really think about the way that detention was handled, where China actually detained two of Canadian citizens and then used them as a bargaining chip, and actually Canada and US gave in to that? Do you think it was a show of a lot of weakness which emboldened China?
absolutely, in fact, if you notice, uh, the Biden Xi meeting does not put America in a strong and great light. In fact, it was almost a supplicant, sort of pleading with the Lord of the Manor that please, let's not fight. Let's find some way of accommodation. We are not interested in war. We are not interested in conflict. Let's find a via media. So I think Biden blew it. If he is putting sanctions on China, for example, on semiconductors, I'll come to that also. Uh, then what is the point of being seen as someone requesting for China's forgiveness in a meeting? And as far as sanctions are concerned, I think it is the most unwise policy that America has adopted in the last few years. At the moment, it has about 11,000 entities, countries, and companies and individuals under sanctions. Okay, they are losing market in America, but isn't America losing 11,000 important countries, entities, and companies and individuals to trade with? Second thing is, take the case of semiconductors. America has said will not be exporting semiconductors to China anymore. Fine, what are the latest statistics in terms of research and development on semiconductors? In the last 1 month, China has overtaken America for the first time. So, if you're saying something, then be sure that you've got all sides covered. Don't get into a mess like the sanctions on Russia on oil and gas. Don't get into a mess where you end up pleading with China. So, you know, I don't know whether China can be subdued or shown its place as America was threatening to do in the manner in which American leadership has conducted itself.
Yeah. So do you think there it has been a bit of a shift after President Biden came in about the kind of kid gloves with which China is being treated and allowing them to get emboldened? Many people think that it is the weakness of Biden which is exactly emboldening China. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't, because at least publicly, Biden has pursued policies which Trump set in place. Initially, there was a feeling that Biden would soften it, but he did not give any indication he did not make any policy changes. But what has happened is that Trump, despite his many faults, and there were many, uh, he publicly, at least, he gave an impression of strength. Whereas Biden does not give that impression, and his mannerism in public platforms do not give the impression of a leader in control of himself. So that is not a good message to convey to your adversary or to the country that you're determined to confront, not so much to cooperate. After all, if you look at their national strategy policy, China is number one in terms of their negative attention. So uh, I I think Biden, in terms of the written script, wants to pursue Trump's policy, but in terms of actual practice, he is giving confused signals.
Hmm. What do you make of Modi's handshake with Xi and the little bit of exchange of smiles? How much can we read into that?
Well, I think that was the right thing to do. Because in diplomacy, even in a war situation, you always have some channel or the other going on. America and Russia are having a back channel. The CIA chief has traveled to Moscow or for meetings in Turkey with the Russian counterpart. So it is always good, even if your dagger's drawn, uh, handshake is not going to cost you anything.
That's right. But do you read something exceptional about looking at it at the first time after the Galwan Valley clashes that they have shaken hands? Does it mean that there's going to be peace between India and China? Do you see anything more than just a smile in it?
No, I won't go into any long-term conclusion on a handshake because the issues are substantial and issues are complex. After all, China has not retreated from Depsang, which is a major chunk, and there are no signs that it is ready to do so. In fact, some reports suggest that it's strengthened its encampments in the LSE or close to the LSE area. So, handshake is good ipso facto, but whether handshake leads to a substantial reduction in tension remains to be seen.
Okay. I'll come to my last question, which is something very close to my heart, and I want to have your thoughts on it. And I want everybody to hear your thoughts on it. And that is that we have a world at the moment which looks very modern, but we still have in place a situation where, as we saw, Russia could very easily get into Ukraine and destroy it. This is not an isolated case. Over the past few years, we have seen various other strong countries coming at whim and just destroying a smaller state with the same pretext that we are trying to save their citizens from their regime. And the end result is they have actually destroyed the country's civilians for decades on end, where they cannot again lift up their lives again. The tragedy is in the trauma and the lives lost. That's one, and it's also most importantly, a birthplace of people who are disgruntled and trauma stricken, and which gives rise to terrorism all over the world, which is a danger to the whole world, danger to humanity. The rules of law that we have in this world at the moment doesn't cater to that. Can you give us some ideas of a framework that might be put in place in this world that can deter a bigger, powerful country from destroying a smaller country or having proxy wars?
Well, you're absolutely right in thinking aloud along these lines because the list of countries which have been ravaged seems to be endless. Libya, Iraq, Yemen, no one talks about
Yeah.
the trauma that Yemenis have gone through and are going through. So, or Armenia, which has been bombarded by Azerbaijan
Mhm.
at whim and almost every few months, not to talk of Russia, Ukraine, and so on. Uh, why is it happening? Is it the law of the jungle or survival of the fittest or the rule of the biggest? Uh, I think we will need some time to reflect over this and come to a conclusion. But to pursue your line of thought, I would say one of the major reasons uh, was that America, when it became the sole superpower, uh, became headstrong in 90s and in early this millennium. It thought it could walk in anywhere and order the world to its desire and whim. That did not happen. It destroyed that place, be it Afghanistan or Libya, Iraq, or whatever. But in terms of putting the mechano, it used to be mechano before the new ones, pieces back into a shape, it said, Our task was only to unscramble, to destroy, not to destroy, but to uh, put in place our design. But our task is not reconstruction. Now that means generations thereafter would be helpless in doing whatever they can to get their life back again. That is one point, the American whims. The second is the simultaneous reduction of UN's role in the world. UN, after all, had a sort of a calming influence for many years post Second World War. That has become negligible almost. You don't hear of UN even giving an early warning signal on COVID and what to do about it. So it is left to nations to think of their own devices. So that is number two. The third is that globalization, which was in a way uniting the world in to some extent, that has almost come to a halt. Now you think of negative globalization, globalization of COVID, globalization of stagnation, globalization of inflation, globalization of wheat shortage, globalization of oil crisis, but you do not hear of what globalization in a positive sense could achieve. Let me take this line of thinking to another track. Whenever there was a crisis earlier, or at least in our recent memory, over the last three generations, let's say, after the Second World War, the world came together, thought of Bretton Woods, thought of Marshall Plan, thought of UN, and had a structure which could guide the world towards surer, calmer waters. And it did. It worked wonderfully. Then came the oil shock of the 70s, and G7 came into existence in order to take care of the consequences of the oil shock and how to handle it. That was the beginning of G7. The next crisis was 2008, 2009, the major financial crisis. And that was the birth of G20. And they came up, at least the big countries came up with a $1 trillion plan to shore up the economies which are majorly affected by the financial crisis. You have mentioned about G20's meeting in Indonesia, in Bali, 2 days back. What is the message coming out of there? Is there even a single reassuring sentence which says that, yes, the world is facing unprecedented crisis? I mean, they started by saying energy security, food crisis, and so on. But
there's no message that we are all together in it and we'll fight it together. It's a fight between each other.
And is there a concrete plan? I've listed out 3 major chapters of the world history where the leadership came up with concrete plans. This time, no one is any wiser as to whether there is a concrete plan which takes the world out of the delicate situation it finds itself in onto a surer grounds.
So what we have, what your the conclusion from what you said is that whenever we have been in a crisis and we have seen something that incentivizes everybody in the world to really put down their heads and put a solution to it, we have come up with something. So till the time we come across a crisis where smaller states getting destroyed creates a crisis all across the world, we will never come to any solution. We'll never put our heads together to think of a solution. Is that what you think?
No, I didn't say that. What I said was that earlier, whenever there was a major crisis, post Second World War, or oil shock, or financial crisis, the leadership of the world had the vision to come up with solutions or possible solutions. The Bali summit, the G20 summit in Bali, has not offered that hope. So I'm not at all saying that you must have wars to end everyone and eliminate all life in this planet for solution to that.
No, it not that, but it happens. It happens to take place only when there is a crisis, isn't it? The
No,
solutions.
no. Naturally, you require solutions when there is a major crisis. You cannot keep on proposing solutions when nothing of problematic nature exists. So, to that sense, you're right. But you do not create problems in order to find solutions. Uh,
That's
that,
true. But what is the incentive for the world to think of smaller states at the moment, to even think of coming up with solutions so that they don't get destroyed?
well, smaller states don't have a voice, unfortunately. The voice that was possible was in two forms earlier. One is United Nations, the other was the non-aligned movement, which had at least some kind of a moral force, nothing beyond that. But even that uh, moral force does not exist because non-aligned has become irrelevant now for all practical purposes, and UN has reduced itself by its own inaction.
Hmm. True. So we can't expect to see any solution in the near future where uh, uh, things like a Ukraine, things like a Libya or a Syria or an Afghanistan just springs up at any point of time unexpectedly. So are we going to go ahead and see that for some time till maybe a crisis brews and people take notice of it?
What you're leading up to is men of vision, leadership of with vision, uh, who can think years in advance and who can come up with preventive solutions that ensure that major problems do not come and become an obstacle to peace and progress.
And the last word from you, do you think really the world is in danger as you have made the title of your book?
I think so. Unfortunately, I think so. That unless we caution ourselves, unless we are careful, we are sliding towards a very slippery slope.
The whole world or certain geographies of the world?
No, I wouldn't include, for example, South America in this. It has had its troubles in the past. At the moment, it is far calmer than rest of the world. Africa, fortunately, is much calmer. The real worry is the worry lines are Asia and parts of Europe. Europe was, in a very luxurious condition so far of having plenty and nothing to worry about, but it is no longer the case. So parts of Europe and Asia, many parts of Asia are unfortunately in a state where you need careful attention.
Wonderful. So lovely to hear you. So lovely to hear so many thoughts from you. A great delight to have you, Ambassador. And I would like to have another session with you at some point of time on India-Pakistan relations, on which you're a huge expert. Thanks so much for joining. A great delight talking to you.
Thank you so much. And you framed your questions with great wisdom and care. So you've done your research very well. And I wish you all success in this new venture of yours. So best wishes. And it was a pleasure being on your program. Thank you.
Thanks. It's hugely encouraging that coming from you. See you again.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.